Hi there and welcome back to 355 Code. Today we will be creating the beginning of a Connect 4 game. And we're going to kind of quickly breeze through the beginning, which is setting up the board, because we've touched on that in several of our other tutorials, which you can check out. And our main goal for this tutorial is to animate the falling effect of a piece when it's placed into the Connect 4 board. And you can basically see it falling and passing through each one of the holes before it lands in its spot. This would be kind of the first step in creating a fully functional Connect 4 game that's animated. And it's quite a challenge because transparency in CSS is not an easy thing. And we'll be using animations, and of course everything will be done completely in JavaScript. So let's get started. So first of all, what we'll want to do is we're going to want to create our board. So let's just declare a constant and we'll call it board. And this will just be a div element. So dot create element. And this is going to be a div. And then we're just going to give it some styling. So let's call this board style. And this is going to be an object which we're going to loop through afterwards and apply it one by one. And I'm really going to run through this, but if you are interested in seeing how we do this, you can check out some of our other videos where I go a little bit more into depth and explain the logic behind setting up the styles in this way. So let's start off with the background color. And let's just make it blue for now, because the Connect 4 is usually blue board. And when you're setting up these keys, it's just important that the right side is going to be strings. And let's give it a solid border. And this is going to be a grid into which we're going to be placing several grid boxes. So let's just say display grid. And it's going to have grid template, columns, and in this case I'm going to be using a template literal just so we can enter some variables here and really turn this whole creation of the board into a function that is a lot more flexible so we can play around with it later. So to create a template literal, you're going to want to use the sideways single quotations, and here we're just going to have repeat. And inside this repeat, so we're going to tell it how many columns we want, and this is actually going to be a variable. So let's just call this columns, and we're going to have another variable here, which is going to be the grid size, or let's call it grid box size. And don't forget we're going to need to add pixel here. And let's already go to the top and kind of create the function, which is this is going to be wrapping this entire process here. So function, and let's just call this create game. And this function is going to take a few parameters. So let's have columns, which we already have down here, rows of course, and grid box size. Okay, and now we really can use the code that we're writing now for other games as well. So when you're done with this project, you can just copy this code over and create other games, and I'll do a short demonstration of that in a moment. Let's continue. So we're going to also have the same for rows. Let's just copy this code over here, and we just need to change this to rows. change this variable to rows as well. And don't forget comma over here and comma over here. Let's see if there's anything else that we want to do. Let's give it a little bit of a gap. We might close this off later, but for now. And anything else that we need at the moment? Okay, so let's leave it like this. And let's go ahead to create our actual grid boxes. And just right before I do that, I'm going to actually apply these styles. And again, I'm not going to be explaining the logic here, but we're just going to use object.keys for board styles. And for each, so board.style is key will be equal to board styles for that key. And here we just have to make sure that we use key as a parameter. Excellent. And last thing, let's body.append child. And you should be quite familiar with this from our other tutorials already. If not, I recommend you kind of brush up on DOM work. And then we're going to append board here. And for other curly braces up here. And let's put another curly brace down here because this is where our function ends. And I like to just always kind of test out the code in between while I'm writing so that, you know, if there's anything wrong, then we can figure it out. And let's see, so let's do 3 by 3 and 20. Okay, so these are the parameters in here. So that's 3 columns, 3 rows, and grid box size. And let's run our code. And you can see that we created a board. And it's very preliminary, so you know, we don't really, there's no way for us to check that it's really 100% what we want. But let's finish putting together our code, and then we can do some more debugging. So except for a board, we're basically going to want to place grid boxes inside this grid that we created. So we're going to do that using a for loop. And just a simple setup, so let I equal 0. And then as long as I is smaller, then here we're going to be using the variables that are passed down in the parameter. So that's columns multiplied by rows. And that's how many times we basically need to run through this loop and place grid boxes. And then just I++. And what are we doing here inside this loop? So we are going to be declaring a new constant, which is going to be grid box. I'm actually just going to copy this code up from up here, because it's going to be very similar to how we created the board. And let's just call this grid box. And it's also a div. This will be grid box style. Okay, this is something I didn't pick up before. I completely misspelled background here, which can explain why it's not blue. And for these, let's do a background color of white, so they stand out. And we're going to be changing some of this later, because as I explained, we're going to be dealing with transparency here and stuff like that. But now, for now, we just kind of want to start setting things up and get some visual of the board. So borders we'll use as well, and this is not going to be grid, but instead these are going to, each one of these is going to have just a height and a width. And width, and these heights and widths are also going to be determined by the grid box size. And for these, we're also going to be using the template literals, just because we have a combination of, string and variables. So this is just really the easiest way to do it. And also, it's going to be here grid box size and pixel. And the same thing goes here for the width. And what's the issue here? I accidentally erased the right quotation mark. Okay, so let's kind of just see, and then here obviously all this needs to be grid box instead. That can stay key. This will be grid box. And this will be grid box style. And here we're going to be appending all of these grid boxes to the board. So now if we run our code, whoops, didn't change this here. Excellent. And as you can see, so we have a board, and we have our grid boxes, and they're already kind of set up nicely in a 3x3. And just to show you how this works, so like if I change the code here, change this to 4, let's say in columns, run the code and it adds a column. So this is a nice little function that we have here. Even though connect 4, we already know that it's going to be a 7x6. This is code that you can reuse for other games. And I'm really here to teach you the thought process. Specifically, what game we create is not the most important thing, even though it's very cool. So, great. Let's do a little more styling. So we're just gonna set this up so that it fits content here in height and width, because now it's kind of extends to the full width of the body. So this is going to be fit content. And here as well, we're going to do for the width is also going to be fit content. Excellent. So let's try running this code, and we see now that the board is kind of fitting to the grid boxes. We can give it a little bit of padding, just so that it's a little more visual. And let's make that 3 pixels, let's say. And great. Okay, so now we see our board, we see our grid boxes, and we can already set this up so it fits the Connect for our game. So that's, as I said, it's a 7x6. Let's make these a little bigger so just we can see everything a little better. So that'll be 40. Okay, so that kind of really extended beyond. Okay, there we go. Let's make it 30. Just yeah, excellent. And now what we really want to do is we want to create holes. Okay, so we have grid boxes here, and visually we are going to want to have a hole inside of each of these grid boxes. And here we're getting to our first complexity, because we're going to be having a piece that's going to be dropping down, and basically we need these holes to be completely transparent and see beyond, even through the board itself. And this is quite a complex thing to do in CSS, to create a transparent hole within a div. And the way we're going to be doing it is by creating a transparent circle and with a solid border. And this border is going to actually become our board. And all we're going to be seeing is transparent holes and their borders in terms of things that will be visual. So let's get started on that. And basically what we need to do is within each one of these grid boxes, we're going to need to attach a hole. So let's copy the code here that we have for creating the grid boxes, because it's going to be very similar to that. And we're just going to call each of these a grid box hole. And grid box hole style. And for here, grid box hole style for each grid box. And grid box hole style. And then we're going to append each of these holes to the grid box. And we're going to append the child of grid box hole. And just so that we can kind of see visually these holes, let's give them a border radius of 50%. And that way we should be able to see that they are circular. Let's try running our code again. Grid box is not defined. Where did I? Dun, dun, dun. So this will be grid box. Okay, run again. And you can see that we have holes now within each of our grid boxes. And let's kind of make these holes a little smaller than the grid boxes themselves. So let's take a look and see how that is. Maybe a little too small, but we'll leave it for now, okay? Because I don't want to get too hung up on visuals. And let's add a margin as well, just so that they're a little more centered. And also this margin, I'm going to be basing off the grid box size. So let's kind of use this code that we have here. And the margin we're going to want to do maybe, let's do grid box size, let's say divided by 4, just to see how that looks. So that's a little too far down. So we're going to want to make it a little smaller. Let's say grid box divided by 5, 6, 7. Okay, that looks pretty good. Again, I don't want to go too deep into thinking about how to style these perfectly for every scenario, because that's not the main part of our tutorial. But basically now we need to figure out the transparency issue. So each of these holes is going to need to be transparent, and we're not going to use the opacity styling of CSS, because that will also make our borders transparent. But rather, we're going to be using the background color. So here, instead of white, we are going to give it a full RGBA, where A stands for alpha, if you remember, and that's basically transparency. And the values that we put here actually won't matter, because this is going to be fully transparent. What's important is that here at the end, we are going to put 0. For the alpha, and that's transparent. So if we run our code again, whoops, that should have been transparent, and let's try and figure out. Okay, so it is transparent, but actually we have here our grid boxes themselves are white, which is which means that we can't see what's going on underneath. So if I change our grid box color, let's say to green, just so it stands out, then you'll see that everything turns green, and that basically is indicating that our background color here is transparent. And we could also change this, let's say to 0.5, and you'll see that it's kind of has this half opacity thing going on here. So this is completely transparent at the moment. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to copy this code, and we're going to make the grid boxes themselves transparent, because they are not something visual in terms of our board. They're more just there for organizing purposes and for styling purposes, which we'll see in a moment. So the last thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to make the board transparent as well. And this is because we want these holes to go all the way through to the background. And now what would happen is that if we dropped a piece here, it would still be, we wouldn't be able to put it between these grid boxes and the board. We want to be able to see, and if we did, then we'd always see this blue background just like we are now. And we actually want our board to be transparent as well. But now we don't have any color in our board, so the way we're going to solve that is by using some borders. Okay, so you can see that in our grid hole style, we have a border that's solid. And if I change the border here, so that's, let's say, border width is, let's say, 5 pixels. Okay, then you'll see that our borders grow, and they kind of seep out of the grid box. Okay, and in order to change that, what we have to do is change a property that's called overflow. And that basically determines what happens when an item within a certain element exceeds the size of the element. And we're going to say that it's hidden. So what's going to happen now is basically you see that our items only go until the edges of our board. Each grid hole only goes till the edges of its grid box. And now what we can do is basically make this border width extremely large. So let's say 10 pixels, let's say even 20 pixels. Okay, and we're going to need to recenter it. So we're going to use something called transform to kind of reposition these the holes so that they're kind of in the center of our grid boxes again. And here we're also going to be using that template literal and translate. And here we're just going to enter a x factor and a y. So, and we're going to be moving this left and up. So it's all going to be in negative. So we're going to be doing negative and grid box size, and let's divide it by 4. Okay, and again here we're going to have some trial and error until we get the correct positioning, and let's see what that looks like. Don't forget a comma. Okay, it is not moving. Grid box hole style, pixels, of course. That's the whole reason that we chose to use this template literal. And okay, so great, so it moved, but not enough. We need to move it more, so let's try 3. No. 2. And that's pretty good. Let's try 1.5. That's a little too much. 1.7. And that is pretty good. So this already should look a little bit like a Connect 4 board to you, if you're familiar with the game. And we can also just add a nice little touch of making this border blue. And that's just using color. So, and now you can see that we have our blue board. We can also see the black dividing lines between the grid boxes as well. You can change that here if you want to make it, let's say, all blue. Here we can do color blue as well. And that will apply and make it a completely blue game. Great. So we set up our board, and now what we need to do is basically add pieces. And the way we're going to do that is whenever we put our mouse above one of these top rows, where you're going to have an imaginary piece that will appear behind the board, and when it's clicked, it'll drop down. So let's get to that, adding pieces, and we're going to do this in a separate function. So let's call this function, and this create game, we can leave that there for now. So we're going to have a new function that's going to be drop piece, and this will include the entire process of creating the piece and dropping it. Sorry, and this is a function, of course. Great, so what has to happen here? This function is going to get a grid box. And basically we're going to be calling this function right here after we create a grid box and we append it. And right here we're going to be calling that function. So it's going to be drop piece, and we're going to pass it the grid box. And basically it'll apply all of these event handlers that we're going to be writing now to each of these grid boxes, and it's just a nice way to kind of break down our code into separate functions, which can help us with debugging and also reusing different elements of the code for different games. And so the first thing we're going to do is going to add a mouse over event listener, because as I said, when we move our mouse over this top row, we want to see an imaginary piece. So that's just grid box dot add event listener, and it's going to be for the event mouse over, and we're going to call an empty function. And basically what we want to do now is we want to identify if we are in the top row, and we're going to be using that, and in order to do that we are going to need to give each of these grid boxes an ID. So right before we append these grid boxes, why don't we say here grid box dot set attribute ID, and for simplicity's sake, let's just give it an ID that's equal to I. Okay, and now here basically what we can do is we can get a certain grid box's ID. So let's say let current column equal grid box dot get attribute ID, and let's console dot log current column. Okay, so just do a quick check and see that our code is all working until now. And this is happening because I wrote the code here and not in our function. So let's get rid of that. And this needs to be in our mouse over function. That way when we put our mouse over a certain grid box, then we will see its ID. Excellent. And now basically what we want to do is that if this ID, so if current column is smaller or equal to 6, then we want to do something. And what do we want to do? We want to create a piece. So let's say piece is equal to, this is going to be, again, it's going to be a div. So document dot create element, div, and we are going to be adding the styles in the same manner that we added the styles up here, so we can kind of just get some inspiration by copying over this code. And this we have already. And let's just format our document. Excellent. So let's just call this piece style. And for color, let's just use red. And so for these, let's use, again, -10 and -10. We don't need to access the overflow here, but we do want to have a border radius of 50%, just so that it's a circle, right? It's a circular piece that's going to be dropped in here. And then here, let's just call this piece style again. And here for each piece. And this is going to be piece style. And for the moment, we don't need an ID. And these pieces, what I'm going to do is append it to board. Okay, so it's not going to be appended to a specific grid box, but it'll be appended to the board in general. Let's see how this works now. So let's run the code, and we have a mouse over. Grid box size is not defined. Let's pass in grid box size to this function as well. And here for drop piece, we'll also give it grid box size, and board is not defined. We can add that as well. And great. Okay, so now when we put our mouse over, we are creating these pieces. Okay, obviously we have some issues here. For one, they're coming out here on the bottom, and they're coming out non-stop. So basically, we're only going to want to create one of these pieces. We're only going to want to have one at a time. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a condition that checks board dot children dot length, and if and we're only going to do this if it's equal to 1. Why 1? Because on this board we already have children that are these, So this board already has a lot of children, which is all these grid boxes. So this is actually not a very good plan. But what we're going to do is we're going to create a wrapper for this board, and this is just going to be this is going to be created outside the create game function. And let's just create a wrapper. And this is also going to be div element. And we don't really need to give it any styling. We just need to append it to the body. And then here, instead of when we create our board, we're going to append it to the wrapper. And when we create, we don't need to pass this in here anymore. And we don't need to use this as a parameter here anymore. And the pieces will be appended to the wrapper instead of to the board. And then here in our condition, we can check here and see the length of the children of the wrapper, because the wrapper should only have one child, which is the board. And if it has one child, then we can add a child, which is the piece. And if not, then we won't add any more pieces. So let's check out our code. And you can see here now, we only added one piece because as soon as we added another child for the wrapper, so it has two children, and then our condition here is not met. So it doesn't create any more children. And now what we want to do is basically give us the ability to get rid of this piece, okay? Because now it's stuck and we can't really have any kind of dynamic functionality. So let's add another event listener to the grid boxes. So grid box dot add event listener, and this time it's going to be mouse out. So when we move out, and we're going to have another function here, and basically when we move out, what we're going to want to do is make this piece element disappear. So let's do that by using remove child. So that'll be wrapper dot remove child piece. Okay, and let's try that out. And piece is not defined here. So let's see where we define piece. And so basically we're going to need to put this event listener within our if statement, because that is where we created this element piece. And that's also the only case that we're going to actually want to add this event listener anyways, if you think about it logically. So that works for us as well. And let's run our code now. And basically, what's happening is that this is kind of firing for some of these, even though it is not the place where the child is attached. So let's first create a visual that will show us where we are actually have the mouse over. Because as you can see now, no matter where I put the mouse, the piece always comes out in the same spot. So let's add a little more styling that will make the piece appear as a condition of which column we put our mouse over. And in order to do that, let's get the coordinates of the column that we have put our mouse over. And the place we're going to do that is where we create our piece element. So here, right before we are creating the piece element, let's get the coordinates of the current column. Okay, and the way we're going to be doing that is by using something called get bounding client. So grid box, and let's declare a variable. So let and let's just call this start x, and this will be equal to gridbox dot get bounding client rect, and this will be equal to dot left. And let's get another, let's declare another variable that'll be start y, and this will be equal to the same thing, but just for top. Okay, and now what we can do basically is this piece, we are going to give it a position of absolute, and then let's say top, and here we're also going to use let's use the literal template here. So let's make this just template literal, start y for top, and here pixels, and as for left, we're going to use start x. And let's test out our code and see what this did for us. So now when we put our mouse over, you can see that the pieces are appearing kind of right above where they are, where it's supposed to be in the in terms of the columns. Okay, so if you think like we're playing the game now, so it's basically an indicator of where we are about to drop the piece. And we can see that it's not completely centered, so for the start X, let's add maybe 10 pixels. And let's try running that again. That was a little too much. 7. And that's pretty good. Okay, so not going to get tied down too much. And that is pretty good. Let's make it a little higher, so that like kind of looks like we're, so that's going to be the other way, right, because we're moving up. Up is always negative in terms of the y-axis. Okay, that's a little too high. Maybe, let's say 20. Okay, great. So now it's like really hovering right over the top of that column. So let's deal with our error now. So failed to execute remove child on node. Node to be removed is not a child of this node. So let's take a look at event listener, mouse out to remove child piece. So basically this is firing even if we don't have a piece, I'm pretty sure. So let's say let's try adding if piece and see if that kind of helps us deal with this error. No, that did not help. So let's see why this might be happening. Okay, so let's try and tap into the children of our wrapper. So let's say wrapper.children, and the first child will always be the board itself, because that's what we add earlier on in our code. So let's say children1. So if it equals to piece, then let's remove child piece. Otherwise, do nothing. And that solved our problem. Okay, so now really it's only going to run this code if we actually have a piece that is appended to our wrapper. Great, so now basically what we want to do is we want to add our animation. And to do that, we're kind of introducing a new concept, which is animations in JavaScript, which is very useful knowledge to have. And so the way we add animations in JavaScript is basically, we'll do that right under this mouse out event listener. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to add another event listener. And this is going to be for click, right? Because that's when we're going to want to drop our pieces. And so when we click on one of these grid boxes, what we're going to do is we're actually going to animate this piece. And the way we do that is by selecting the element that we're going to be animating. And then we use a method called animate. Okay, and this takes two options. One is keyframes, and one is options. And we're just going to use those parameters, and above it we're going to kind of define what each of these is. So let keyframes, and this keyframes needs to be an array actually. So I created it as an object, but this actually should be an array of objects. And basically this will just kind of include the changes to the style that we're making of this piece or of any element in JavaScript. And we'll write it out like this. So transform, because we're going to be changing the position of the piece. And we're going to be moving this piece on the y-axis, so we're just going to do translate y. And just for simplicity's sake, let's say we're going to translate y 500 pixels. Okay, so basically when our animation plays, it's going to take this piece and it's going to move it 500 pixels down. And the options is basically where we can define how long that will take. And there are other kind of options and stuff that you can set here as well, but we're going to do this really simple, and we're only going to be setting the duration of this animation, and it's in milliseconds, so let's say over the course of 1 second. Okay, and as you can see here, this is an object. So keyframes is an array of objects, and options is an object in itself. And anything that you don't define, we'll just be using the default, and you can check the documentation if you'd like to learn what those defaults are. So let's check out our code. And basically, so now we have our pieces. Event listener, not event listen. Sorry, event listener. And when we click, you can see that our piece kind of drops down. Okay, and it's dropping way too far. So what we can actually do if we want to be really smart is kind of define this in terms of our grid box sizes. Let's just see if we pass that on. Yeah, so we passed on grid box size here to as a parameter. So here we can actually just use grid box size. And let's say times rows. Okay, and let's check that out. Oh, we didn't define rows. So let's just say times 6. Okay, we'll give it that. And when we click, obviously nothing happens because this needs to be pixels. And let's try running the code again. And it drops down all the way till pretty much the bottom. And this is something that we're going to need to adjust later on when we develop the full game, because, you know, obviously when it's dropping, if it drops down and there's a piece somewhere on the way, then it's going to stop midway. Okay, and that's functionality that we would add later on, the logic of the game. But for now, we're just kind of wanted to develop this basic thing. And now for the last and most important part is that we want this piece to be falling within the board. Okay, so now it's kind of falling in front. It looks like I kind of dropped the piece in the wrong spot. But basically what we want to happen is that when this piece falls down, you'll just see it through these white holes as it's falling down. And that's kind of the logic behind why we styled our entire board the way we did. And basically what we need to do for this to work is that our pieces need to be in back of the board. And the way we do that is by changing the z-index of our pieces to -1, okay? Because the default is going to be 0 or 1 for the other elements. So if we do -1, this should be enough to move it back behind our other elements. And let's try running our code again. And now you can already see that when I hold the piece up here, you can already see it's behind our board. And when I drop it, you can see that the piece is dropping through the holes just as it would through a regular Connect 4 board. So congratulations, you finished the first part of this tutorial for Connect 4. And this is actually the hard part because transparency, as I said, in CSS is not an easy thing, especially when you just want to make one specific part of the div transparent. And this is very useful information that you'll be able to use later on when you're coding other projects. We also created this in a very modular way using functions, so you can really implement a lot of this code in some of the other projects that you build. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, please don't forget to give us a like and subscribe to our channel to see more like this, and we'll see you next time.